Hello. Today I would like to talk about watercolors in a very general sense. And with my recent Kickstarter Mini Palettes project, I've had a lot of questions about what kind of paints to be using in here and how to go about filling and what sorts of pigments to use and stuff like that. So I wanted to talk about that and show you a little bit about the story of how these got developed and talk about the difference between pan and tube paints. So first of all, let's do that. Let's look at some pan paints, pan pigments. This is a kid's watercolor set. I grabbed it out of my 8-year-old daughter's desk, and it is extremely goopy and gooey at the moment because I think she was storing it sideways and the binder of this stuff was not very solid. Anyway, this is something similar to what I'm sure a lot of you have played with at some point in your lives, possibly in elementary school. And this is another kid's set of colors. This one is Prang, and this one is, I think, some kind of German brand. It is Angora watercolors. Anyway, the big thing about children's watercolors generally is that they're fairly cheap. They usually cost between $2 to $7 or so for a set. And they usually have a whole lot of binder and not as much pigment. Now, binder is what holds the pigment together. It's the goop that holds the color, actually. And then there's the color itself, which is called the pigment. Now, if it is more binder than pigment, generally it is fairly cheap, which means that your paintings won't be as vibrant and colorful as it would be if you were to use professional quality watercolors and pigments. So if you are at all serious about using watercolors, I would highly suggest looking for something that is at least student quality, but also professional quality is going to be the highest. And these are things that would be labeled at the art stores as you come across your pigments. Now, these are various brands of watercolor tubes that I have in my collection. There's Holbein and Da Vinci and Winsor Newton and Daniel Smith. So I mostly use Daniel Smith with some Winsor Newton as well, primarily for my paints. Let me show you now an adult professional quality pan set of paints. And they are called pan sets because the pigments come in these little pans, larger pan sets. And they are, in general, a predefined set of colors that you cannot pick and choose. They just come as they are, and you buy the entirety. If you instead want to pick and choose your colors, then it would be going for tubes. And at first I started off with my pan set, and I used this for I used it for about a decade. It is extremely messy. My set, not pan sets in general. But this was what I used for about 10 years. And as I used it, I discovered that some colors, such as Payne's Gray here, I was using a whole lot of, and it was vanishing much quicker than my other colors and paints. And so I was constantly having to refill it. And you could do so either by buying another little pan thing to insert here, because all of these are removable, or you could use tubes and refill it at your leisure with however much you want. So you just squeeze it in there. It's this goopy stuff. And when it dries, it becomes just like the rest of the pan items in here. And you can close up your set and use it at your leisure. You can just start painting with stuff whenever you feel like. So that was why I began to enjoy using tubes much better, much more so than pan sets, because I was able to customize my own array of colors and use whatever I wanted from whatever brands I wanted. They didn't have to be limited to any single brand. And you don't have to just stick them into a pan and let them dry. You can also use them straight from the tube like this. You just squeeze it out into your mixing palette and get a piece of paper, get some brushes, get some water, and add a little bit of water to it. And then you can just start painting directly with it. And the great thing about tubes then is that your pigment is much more concentrated and you have much more control over the concentration of your colors versus if you just bought something in a pan and that's your only option then is working from the dry pigment, which is fine too. I mean, I can just take any of my dry pigments, for example, from here, which are tube colors that I have squeezed into my mini palette. And all I have to do to reactivate it, you see right now, everything is dry here. So when I'm storing this, all I do is I stick it into my tin, which can actually fit both of these at the same time. And when I want to use it, I just pull it out like that. And I can just use some water into the color of my choice and start painting with it. Or if I wanted to mix some colors, I could pull it out into here, get some quantity of it out. And let's see, what else am I going to mix? I'm going to make that like a brighter yellow color. And start using it. Alright, so what about storing your palette when you're done working with it? Well, first of all, what I would do is I would wash out my mixer because you can't have the wet paint in here because it will just kind of flow and get all over stuff. So I would, dry things off as much as you can. It wouldn't have to be entirely clean. Sometimes I have my other mixer palette just with my dried colors because I actually like using some of the dried and mixed colors that I have been working with. But you dry it off like that, and this, for the most part, even though I've used them, they're a little damp, but they could easily just go back in. They're not going to start slopping around or falling out anywhere unless you use tons of water in here and got everything really messy. In that case, you would have to let things dry out a little bit. But, I could just stick it in there like that, and everything is good to go. Ready for your next painting session. If I'm at home, I usually do let things dry out completely first, though, before sticking it back in. That's just because I have that convenience, but it wouldn't be entirely necessary to do that. Something that I love to use when I am traveling and I'm carrying my pigments with me and I want to just draw something or paint something quickly is to use a water brush. This is well, let me show you how this works. This is it's sort of a brush pen, right? But instead of having ink stored in the cartridge, it's water. You can fill it up with water. You just squeeze this under your tap and let the water go into there. Screw on the brush tip. And then when you want to moisten your tip, you squeeze this. Sometimes water squirts out like that. Yeah, I see. And you get the brush tip loaded with water, and then all you need to do is you can just start painting with it. It's pretty cool. I love these things for minimal fuss when I'm traveling and I want to just do a quick wash of some color over something that I'm working on in my sketchbook, because you don't need to then have your jar of water or anything else that might spill. It's just all here and handy. Let me show you also some of how the mini palette evolved. First of all, I was using this enormous palette once upon a time. This thing is like 14 inches wide, and there's a lot of wasted space I felt with it. Although if I were to be doing very large paintings, I do have to say that this would be useful because I can have much more of my pigment at any one time. But then I would probably, if I was going to be using that much pigment, I would probably just put it into my mixing dish straight out and use it like that instead. So there, there's this thing, this huge, enormous thing. And then I made this slightly more compact one, which had more colors and a slightly smaller footprint. It was nice and thin. So this was fairly easy to transport, but for the most part, this is much more pigment than I ever needed whenever I was traveling. Most of all, when I was traveling, I wanted all of my colors because, of course, it always would happen that whatever color I did not choose to bring was the one that I wanted to use. Oh, and let me show you, I have this entire box full of all my tube pigments. So there's a lot of selection that I've got going on. This is something that I sort of played around with making. It was just a little custom made miniature selection of colors that I did with blister pill packs. And the problem with this, though, was it was very, very flimsy. And so I was not able to, I wasn't really satisfied with it because it was just too floppy. And it was fun to make, but it was not very satisfactory to use. And then, of course, there is the much more refined version that I finally evolved into, and that would be the Mini palette.